Every second, there are 4 screaming, red-faced bundles of joy that enter our crazy world, and each of them represents a blank slate. At such a young age, the only thing that affects their own choices now or in the future are their experiences and the people around them. For many children, this is a time filled with fluffy blankets, bright outfits, and a family that surrounds them with love. But for 7.4 million children in just the United States, this is a time of pain and suffering. Children who experience child abuse and neglect and/or witness domestic violence are the silent victims in a system that is incapable of protecting them. Every day, nearly 5 children die due to child abuse and neglect. It's always unacceptable to abuse another person, but when it comes to the most young and fragile members of our society, the long-term effects of such abuse create a generational cycle. To truly tackle this problem, we have to invest in our youth by acting ourselves and giving them the opportunity to break free. But before we can save our children, we have to ask what they go through and why we need to act. Child abuse, as defined by psychology today, is the maltreatment of a child through intentional physical, emotional, or sexual harm or neglect. The thing with children is that oftentimes they are so young and dependent on their abuser for basic needs that they are literally unable or afraid to speak out. In fact, 70% of fatalities occur under the age of 3. In addition, many abusers are parents who supposedly love their children the most, justifying their actions as tough love. So the burden truly falls on us. As educators, coaches, family friends, and even as parents, we need to pay attention to the children around us and be the voice that they need. Oftentimes, it's hard to understand that this occurs in any demographic all the time. But that's the terrible reality, and it will remain a reality unless we're willing to create progress. To initiate progress, we have to be like doctors and understand the common symptoms of child abuse. Physical and sexual harm are generally well known, but what often goes unnoticed is emotional harm and neglect. This includes threatening, belittling, and denying proper comfort, which makes a child feel worthless, trapped, and helpless. Physical harm is the easiest to identify because it offers real marks and bruises. Common symptoms of sexual abuse can include inappropriate thoughts, statements, or actions for a child of that age, persistent abdominal pain, constantly fearful behavior like nightmares, bedwetting, and child depression, and finally, if the act has just occurred, bleeding from the genitals. And finally, with emotional abuse and harm, it can take place with common symptoms like runaway attempts, rapid changes in self-confidence, and constantly fearful behavior. And in extremely young children, the inability to gain weight and desperately affectionate behavior. We need to pay attention to such symptoms in the children around us. It may seem paranoid, but when the Department of Health and Human Services, 100 children, 1,700 children die every year due to child abuse, there needs to be a change and a voice for the voiceless. Each of us here can be that voice. Now, a common area of confusion for many parents is the division between discipline and abuse. Though it may seem subjective, in reality there is a clear boundary. Providing an accurate explanation and non-harmful consequences can be constructive. But when a parent simply attacks a child verbally, physically, or emotionally, it makes a child feel worthless, trapped, and helpless. That is abuse. We need to stop thinking of discipline as a measure to place children under control and understand how we would feel reacting to harm rather than empathy, encouragement, and education. After all, children are just younger and more fragile versions of ourselves and not objects to be controlled. It's also important to ensure that children are not exposed to situations with intimate partner violence, better known as domestic violence. Not only does direct harm cause issues, but when a child watches parents, for example, in an abusive relationship, it causes emotional trauma and stress. So it's important to not only watch our own actions with current and future children, but be observant of others as well. Because if we choose not to, the long-term effects can be disastrous. Children generally look up to their parents and learn from them. So if a child is watching a parent in an abusive relationship, they may perceive that power is more important in a relationship than love and respect. In fact, children who witness domestic violence are 6 times more likely to be abusers themselves, only continuing this toxic cycle. Also, children who suffer from direct harm can struggle with intimacy and vulnerability in future relationships and from mental illness. 80% of 21-year-olds who were abused as children fall into the category of at least one mental illness. And 30% of children who are abused now will go on to abuse their own children, only continuing this cycle. Without helping our children, we leave them in abusive situations where role models continue to make love synonymous with abuse. Something that is beautiful and pure is blurred into something painful. So what can we do? With abuse numbers in the millions, it may seem like our actions are pointless. But sheer numbers should never be a deterrent when it comes to saving a child's life. And at least we can mitigate these problems in our own communities. So we need to do 3 things. 1, be observant of our own and others' actions and possible symptoms. 2, speak up when there is a problem. And 3, put our children above family preservation. I've already explained why the first 2 are important, but placing our children over family preservation is something we have neglected to do for the last 38 years. In 1980, the Adoption and Child Welfare Act began the system that values family preservation over out-of-home placement. In its actual text, the law mandates reasonable effort to preserve the family in order to prevent overusing the foster care system that hurts children's mental health. In theory, this was a step in the right direction, but our Department of Health and Human Services took this as a mandate to swing the pendulum from one extreme to another. In fact, Child Protective Services, the agency through which these cases are handled, is only provided with federal funding if they can somehow prove reasonable effort was taken to preserve the family. This means that institutions are forced to leave children in abusive households for longer periods of time, simply to justify that reasonable effort was taken to preserve the family. Also, our legal system is not free from this bias. Recent studies show that trends are actually in favor of abusers gaining the custody of children. This is because generally the non-abusive parent has to leave the household to then sue for custody. And court officials with our new mentality feel that family preservation is more important than the child's health. So they rule in favor of the abusers because at least they tried to preserve the family unit. For example, when I was 16 and I attended a domestic violence training, a victim gave her own story. She was forced into prostitution from a young age, and only at the age of 8 she tried to speak out. But local authorities simply sent her back to her family and told her mother about the incident. That night, her mother beat her until part of her spine chipped off. She struggles with spine pain to this day, and that one instance where local authorities simply sent her back silenced her for years. And the cycle only continued as her own husband beat and raped her every day. She was only able to escape this abuse after trying to treat herself. But when she came back to gain custody of her 3 sons, the court almost ruled against her, because apparently the father was a better option since at least he had tried to preserve the family unit. Though there was evidence all of her sons had been abused, it took multiple psychologists to gain her custody. And it is amazing that she gained custody, but this should have never been an issue. Our obsession with the family unit, coupled with our massive lack in understanding, dangles help in front of weakened victims only to rip it away. One misstep, one false negative can scar our children for years. So it's time to put these misguided beliefs aside and put our children over everything. Family is important, but it isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love. So by doing our 3 burdens, we can at least give our children the chance for nurturing love. So first, pay attention to the children around you. It may seem paranoid or intrusive, but when a child's life is at risk, it's not another family's private issue. Watch the children around you, and if you see symptoms or a problem, speak up. But speak up doesn't just mean calling the police. It means being there for a child. With physical and sexual abuse, where actual evidence like bleeding, marks, or bruises are there, you can call the police and legal intervention can have the child removed. But with emotional harm and neglect, there is no physical evidence, so legal intervention is impossible. In these situations, speaking up means something completely different. It means offering comfort and validation. If you see the abuse occur, then you have the opportunity to tell that person that their behavior is unnecessary and incorrect. Though it may seem like it won't change the abuser, if nothing else, it validates that child that their distress is warranted. Also, if you see a child suffering from emotional abuse or neglect, it's time to listen. Ask them if they want to talk about something in private. Give them a safe place to discuss these situations. Though it may seem like you aren't doing anything, offering comfort is incredibly important, and especially to children so young who may believe like these actions are justified, you can prove to them that nobody deserves to be treated like that now or in the future. And after hearing about these situations, Psychology Today recommends that you help these children get in contact with mental health professionals. This may seem like a large responsibility, and it is, so use local resources to help you. For example, the Marjorie Mason Center is a local domestic violence shelter that offers safe housing, counseling, and crisis support in the Fresno-Clovis area. To access these services and anything else, all you have to do is call their 24-hour confidential hotline at 559-233-HELP or 4357. Also, you can contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at any time for information and support. Lastly, put the child above everything. Obviously, being vigilant and speaking out even when it's uncomfortable are the first steps. But as a society, we have to change our actions. I'm not delusional, and I don't think our Department of Health and Human Services or our legal system are going to change overnight. But a society is made of individuals like you or me. And with our viewpoints and our actions changing, we can create progress. So it's not somebody else's problem. It's time to invest in our children, and it's time to break this cycle.